Hello, class. Welcome into a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know the famous Battle of Saratoga was actually two separate battles? That General Howe basically abandoned General Burgoyne, leaving him high and dry for what would be the most consequential loss of the war. And then following the victories at Saratoga, the entire complexion of the war changed, with the inclusion of the French fighting alongside the Americans. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 64, Saratoga, the turning point of the war. Hello and welcome into episode 64, and today we will discuss the events that were happening simultaneously to what we talked about last week at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, but these will be victories for the Americans, and they will, as I mentioned in the lead, bring the French into the war. Before we get into that, I would like to give a shout out to Lanae Benson for being our newest patron. What we come to find in Burgoyne's attempt to march south and take Albany and execute this plan is that Britain was still, quote, grasping the implications of the revolutionary idea that they were fighting a people in arms rather than a professional army, quote provided by historian George Billis. Because, see, England was engaged in a war of ideas, not a contest of armies like in a traditional European sense. We can see this disconnect continuing to play out in the colonies as the war progresses into the future. But while the British were struggling with this, on the flip side, Burgoyne did argue that an approach like that would be politically dubious. He argued for the use of Native Americans, foreigners, and black slaves in the South. He wanted to arm the political enemies of the colonies, which would go right back to one of the chief complaints of the Second Continental Congress mentioned in their argument for independence. But with this strategy in hand, Burgoyne arrived in Canada, had some tension with Guy Carleton as he took over command of the British forces, and Burgoyne determined that he was going to be in command, get the support he needed, and then leave south for Albany. While he was given considerably less men, a couple thousand men, than he thought he would be, he figured he was well supplied enough to begin his trek. In June of 1777, Burgoyne moved south from the province of Quebec with about 8,500 men to gain control of the upper Hudson River Valley. He was held up in capturing Fort Ticonderoga and had to leave almost 1,000 men behind to defend the fort. But this was a huge victory. The British were able to take back Fort Ticonderoga. King George III, when hearing of this, said, quote, "I have beat the Americans." As my fellow history nerd Zach Woods would say, you called that one at halftime, big guy. In addition to taking Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne the following month, in August of 1777, lost about 1,000 men at the Battle of Bennington. Really a disaster for Burgoyne and the British. And of course, one of the reasons it was a disaster for the British was because reinforcements arrived late, because they were marching at approximately 1 mile per hour in parade fashion. So by the end of August, having taken Ticonderoga and leaving men at Ticonderoga and then losing another 1,000 men at Bennington, Burgoyne had only about 6,500 men left in his forces. And while he was continuing to travel toward Albany, he found out that St. Leger, who had a force of about 1,700 men, had been unsuccessful at his attempt to lay siege to Fort Stanwix and travel through the Mohawk Valley, and that he had to turn back northward up the Mohawk River Valley and abandon the plan to meet in Albany. This was really a crushing defeat for the British because not only did St. Leger have to turn back and wasn't able to support that Burgoyne would desperately need. But the Native American allies also abandoned St. Leger. They realized his forces were too weak to continue, and they saw the writing on the wall. To make matters even worse for Burgoyne, what we talked about last week, General Howe also abandoned Burgoyne. He was supposed to, initially at least, sail his forces north to meet Burgoyne at Albany, but as we discussed, he called an audible and took his army on a campaign to capture Philadelphia. And with this, the rivalry between Howe and Burgoyne begins to become more obvious because, as I mentioned last week, albeit briefly, Howe likely was looking for his own battlefield honors here, trying to redeem himself for Trenton and Princeton, and maybe even hopes to finish GW off once and for all after he failed to do it at the Battle of Long Island and White Plains. But another thing we need to keep in mind here is that Howe made this decision after Burgoyne had taken Ticonderoga, so at least it makes a little bit of sense. A lot of history teachers that I talk to who teach about the Revolution, and I've seen some do it, almost treat Howe's decision to take Philadelphia like a totally short-sighted, unilateral decision that was driven only by vainglorious attempts to summon some type of reputation or attention to himself. And while, yeah, obviously that probably played a role because he is a human being after all, and a pretty vain one at that, Howe assumed that Burgoyne was easily on his way to Albany. I mean, he had already taken Ticonderoga. And remember, King George III was the one that said, quote, "I have beat the Americans." So it seemed to make sense, right? Burgoyne was only 70 miles from his destination. By this point, Burgoyne should have recognized the perilous situation he found himself in and turned around and headed back to Ticonderoga. But that's me being an armchair general, which is, in the end, the only general I'll ever be. And remember when I mentioned that the British were moving so slowly when reinforcing Burgoyne at the Battle of Bennington? Well, as Burgoyne continues toward Albany, he's going to continue to move really slow because losing out on many of the Native American allies that he did following his loss at Bennington is a primary reason why the British will take about a month to march less than 25 miles. He had lost his eyes and his ears in the forest, which was crippling to his efficiency. Now let's transition from the men in charge of the British forces to those in charge of the Americans. And I want to talk about 3 different men. These 3 men are Philip Schuyler, Benedict Arnold, and Horatio Gates. Now, Schuyler was an aristocratic New Yorker. He was despised by many New Englanders for his obvious distaste for them and how distant he often was from his men. Horatio Gates was almost the polar opposite of Schuyler. He loved the New England militia and was much more relaxed, laid back, and personable than Schuyler was. Schuyler and Gates argued over who should have total command of the Northern Army. The Continental Congress made things worse by initially giving command to Gates that spring, in April, and then changing their minds and giving it back to Schuyler in May. And it seemed like Philip Schuyler was going to be the man to lead the Northern Army. But then Ticonderoga was lost, and it made them change their minds. And while Ticonderoga really was very difficult to defend, and it's hard to blame Schuyler for it, the Second Continental Congress viewed the loss at Ticonderoga as a crushing defeat, way more important than it actually was, just like King George did. And they basically thought Philip Schuyler had no good reason for losing Ticonderoga, and he deserved to have his command taken from him. So, after the Continental Army began their slow retreat from Ticonderoga under the command of Philip Schuyler, the Second Continental Congress on August 19th handed it over to Horatio Gates. The American forces were ecstatic to see Gates take back control of the army and ready for a fight. One soldier said, quote, "Gates's arrival raised us as if by magic. We began to hope and then to act." And it makes sense because Gates is the guy that the militia loved because of how he treated them with respect and dignity. He didn't shame them for not re-enlisting and only using them when absolutely necessary, which is what you should do with the militia. And of course, we have to recognize that, yes, even back in the 18th century, there was a natural rivalry between New Yorkers and New Englanders. They don't always get along and pretty much never have. Just ask Yankees and Red Sox fans. During this time, we also see the American militia numbers growing at a steady pace. With Gates coming back and the enthusiasm for the fighting increasing, the American numbers began to increase with it. Confidence was raised following the Battle of Bennington, and many Americans were ready to dive into the fight. Also, there's another anecdotal story that led to some increased support. A woman named Jane McCrae. She was a fiancée of a loyalist in Burgoyne's forces and was murdered by natives under Burgoyne's command. These natives were, apparently, the story goes, they were supposed to be bringing her to Burgoyne's camp. They got into an argument, whether it was directly with Jane or with each other. No one's really sure, but they ended up murdering her and scalping her and bringing her scalp back to camp. And Burgoyne was, shocked. He was horrified by what had happened. And he wanted to initially punish those responsible. But he realized that if he punished those natives that were responsible, he'd likely lose the support of many of the natives under his command. So he relented to the political pressure and did not pursue the guilty party. Once word spread of these Native Americans brutally murdering an innocent woman and Burgoyne not punishing or pursuing the guilty party, a propaganda campaign was set off against Burgoyne and the British, leading to even more of the aforementioned increase in Patriot recruitment. As Gates took over Schuyler's forces, he saw this increase in Patriot recruitment, and Washington added to it, lending a helping hand, sending an all-star roster of men north to join Gates in his pursuit of Burgoyne. Washington sent Benedict Arnold, who, like I mentioned last episode, had come out of his semi-retirement and stopped sulking like a baby in Connecticut and was ready to fight again. Washington sent Major Benjamin Lincoln, 750 men from Israel Putnam's forces in the New York Highlands, and, in my opinion, most importantly, the old wagoner, Colonel Daniel Morgan, and his specialty riflemen. And you may be wondering, is this the same Daniel Morgan taken prisoner at the Battle of Quebec? Well, yes it is. He had been released in a prisoner exchange and was ready to fight. And then you may say, wait, is this the same B.A. Daniel Morgan who also fought at Braddock's defeat in the French and Indian War? Why, yes it is. And he's going to wreak havoc on Burgoyne and his men in these battles of Saratoga. Keep in mind, Washington himself never traveled up for support because he didn't, remember, actually think that Howe would abandon his plan for Philadelphia. In retrospect, Washington should have taken his men north too. Easy for me to say, but he should have taken his men north to meet Gates and crush Burgoyne, which would have then possibly allowed them to turn back south and take on Howe as a combined force. But it is what it is. On September 7th, Gates and his army marched north of Albany, New York, outside of Saratoga, and they set up defensive works at Bemis Heights, which overlooked the area and controlled the only road to Albany. Therefore, Burgoyne and his men will have to march directly through the Americans if they were going to continue to Albany, New York. The first battle of the battles of Saratoga is the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19th. After crossing the Hudson, Burgoyne proceeded cautiously, With his Native American allies waning, his intelligence of the American forces was less than ideal. As he approached the American forces, skirmishes had broke out, but in retrospect, they were overshadowed by the budding feud between Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates back in the American camp. Because, see, Gates and Schuyler did not get along well at all, which we've mentioned. Well, when Arnold joined the equation and was sent to Saratoga to meet Gates, he brought a number of Schuyler's officers with him, inserting himself directly into the middle of the two men's feud. Both of them had enormous egos, and this will hamper the ability of Gates and Arnold to get along and to effectively operate the battle plans during the battles of Saratoga. Gates sent Arnold and Daniel Morgan off of the heights to Freeman's Farm to meet the British advance with about 3,000 men. And this area is called Freeman's Farm because it was a farm owned by a guy named Freeman. Pretty straightforward. And although Gates and Arnold didn't get along that well, Gates gave Arnold control over the left flank of the forces, which was a critical command. I mean, Gates recognized just how good Benedict Arnold really was. To the left of the American line was a heavily wooded area, and Arnold correctly predicted that the British were probably going to try to outsmart them and maneuver through the area and outflank his left flank. And I'll be putting maps up of this on Facebook and Twitter if you'd like to check it out. Arnold requested that Gates allow him to leave his position to meet the British in the forest. But Gates declined and told Arnold to stay put. He did, however, send Daniel Morgan off of his position and told him to do some recon. As Morgan and his riflemen were doing some recon, they ran into an advance column, and not realizing that it was Burgoyne's main force, they attacked, beginning the first Battle of Saratoga, like I mentioned earlier, the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The fighting lasted all day. With various lulls in the battle, Morgan's sharpshooters were incredibly effective, picking off British officers at an alarming rate. Roger Lamb, a British soldier, wrote that, quote, "In this battle, an unusual number of officers fell, as our army abounded with young men of respectability at this time, who after several years of general peace, anterior to the American Revolution, were attracted to the profession of arms. 3 subalterns, which are officers, of the 20th Regiment on this occasion, the oldest of whom did not exceed the age of 17 years, were buried together. Around 3 p.m., the British pushed a strong counterattack and put the Americans on their heels. Just as it looked like the British may take the battle, darkness set in, which, of course, as we've come to find, is like the Americans' best friend. I mean, if the sun were up all day, all the time, oh man, this would have been a very different war. But darkness set in again, and the Americans were able to successfully retreat. But the British had taken the field, but they didn't take the field without huge losses. After the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19th, Burgoyne counted up his losses, and they numbered over 600 men. Following the battle, the Americans gathered to determine what the next steps would be, and it was clear to everyone that the relationship between Arnold and Gates was going from bad to worse. Gates had reported the action of September 19th to the Second Continental Congress and failed to mention Arnold at all, who did, I glossed over it, but Arnold did an incredible job commanding his men, and by many eyewitness accounts was intimately involved in holding down the left and the center and fighting the British off. But Gates didn't really even mention him, indirectly taking all of the credit for himself. Meanwhile, the battle was actually fought by Arnold's men under his command and direction in the field, whereas Gates was safely hunkered down in his tent. Arnold, as you can imagine, was pretty angry following the Battle of Freeman's Farm because he was not given the respect he deserved and the attention he deserved for victory, and during the battle, he wasn't given the men that he demanded. The two got into a shouting match where Arnold found himself officially relieved of command and left fuming in his tent. While Arnold was sulking and Gates was trying to gather his men for the next British attack, Daniel Morgan and his men set off to bother the British as much as they possibly could. And for the next 2 weeks, Daniel Morgan's men attacked the British unmercifully, not allowing Burgoyne or his men to scout the area effectively. And even though everything seemed to be turning against him, Burgoyne decided he was going to take another shot at the Americans and make one more attempt to break through the American lines. This is where Burgoyne's vanity and his overconfidence ended up really hurting him. Burgoyne had planned on attacking the American forces again on September 21st, but decided to hold off. He had received a letter from General Henry Clinton, who was in the New York Highlands. Remember the guy that Howe abandoned to head to Philadelphia? Clinton had said that he would be attempting to travel north to meet up with Burgoyne's forces. And after conferring with his men who had advised him to retreat, Burgoyne decided he would stay and attack the American left flank with a couple thousand men. But this left flank of the Americans had grown to over 10,000 men in between the battles. Over the last couple weeks, the recruitment was picking up big time, and men were flowing into Saratoga to support the American forces. Now, keep in mind that during this time, Washington was busy losing to Howe at Brandywine and Monmouth. And in between these two battles, he had requested that Gates send him Daniel Morgan and his men. And fortunately for all of us Americans, Gates said, yeah, no thanks. And that brings us to the second Battle of Saratoga on October 7th, the Battle of Bemis Heights. Burgoyne had led just over 2,000 troops on the American left, leaving only about 3,500 behind in his main camp. There were more than 8,000 Americans that took the field that day at the Battle of Bemis Heights, and on the American left flank, Morgan and his men were going to work. Burgoyne was almost killed, with bullets hitting his horse, his hat, and his coat. What a lucky guy. The first phase of the battle saw about 400 British soldiers perish, and Burgoyne and his men slowly retreat from their positions. At this point, Arnold had been relieved from his duty by Gates, like I mentioned, and was continuing to sulk in his tent. But growing restless, he believed that the battle was going to be a stalemate if he did not participate, and he wanted to do something about it. So, without Gates's permission, he left the tent and came to the, quote, rescue of Morgan and his men. When the Americans counterattacked, led by the familiar face of Benedict Arnold, they heard him scream, quote, "Now come on, boys. If the day is long enough, we will have them in hell before night." Arnold led multiple advances toward the British redoubts, eventually taking a critical redoubt just before dusk, exposing the British camp and leaving them far too vulnerable to continue to fight. Arnold then led successive frontal assaults on the British lines without success, but he finally led the Connecticut Brigade and a few other regiments in a furious attack against the right flank. This one succeeded. Arnold fell wounded and was permanently crippled. But during this attack on the British flank, Arnold's horse was hit and fell on his leg, suffering a broken leg and a permanent wound. The Americans, losing 150 men, their casualties paling in comparison to the 700 that the British lost. Arnold has generally received credit for the victory at the Battle of Bemis Heights, but you could argue that Arnold's charge was reckless and even foolhardy, and that Gates's strategy would have worn down the British anyway, and it wasn't really even necessary. Burgoyne kept dragging his feet as the Americans were gaining in number and surrounding him. And in the end, Burgoyne looked back at his camp after the sun had fallen on October 7th and the Battle of Bemis Heights had ended, and recognized that he lost well over 1,000 men in these two battles, while the American casualties were about half that. With the increased recruitment and the men streaming into the American camp, Burgoyne recognized he was probably outnumbered by about 3-1. A week and a half following the Battle of Bemis Heights, he signed his surrender. Now, these men were supposed to be able to go back to England, and actually Horatio Gates agreed to those terms. Send them back to England as long as they promised not to fight again. I kid you not, that's actually was like a thing in the 18th century. But Congress sort of wisened up and said, hold on a second, if we send them back to England, maybe they personally won't fight again, but England will just send guys over to replace them. So yeah, let's not do that. So Congress actually violated the terms of this surrender and held them as prisoners of war until the end of the war. After the Battle of Freeman's Farm and the Battle of Bemis Heights, the battles of Saratoga, Burgoyne returned to England and was never given another commanding position. This was a crippling blow, not just to the British forces, but also their reputation. 1/5 of all the British forces in America either fell in battle or were captured at the battles of Saratoga. The plan to cut off New England was a failure for a lot of different reasons that we've covered this episode and last episode. And this was their only real plan in the North, and now they're back at square one. They're over 2 years into the war, and now all of a sudden they're back at square one trying to figure out what they're going to do next. And throughout this process, the British also realized that these American forces, now a couple years in, were far more competent than they originally expected. A British lieutenant noted that, quote, the courage and obstinacy with which the Americans fought were the astonishment of everyone, and we now became fully convinced that they are not the contemptible enemy we had hitherto imagined them, incapable of standing a regular engagement, and that they would only fight behind strong and powerful works. In the end, following the battles of Saratoga, Arnold was promoted for his bravery, but it was not enough, as we know he would later plot to turn against America. Horatio Gates received a ton of credit for this victory and was put in charge of the Southern forces, where he will suffer a fast fall from grace at the Battle of Camden. And did I mention that following this battle, the French recognized that these Americans, they have a real chance here, and they decided to get involved, turning this conflict into a global war, something we'll cover more next week. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. The book recommendation for this week is The Men Who Lost America, British Command During the Revolutionary War and the Preservation of the Empire by Andrew O'Shaughnessy. My fellow history nerd, Zach, read this book, absolutely loved it, popped it in the mail over to me, and I read it, and it was fantastic, giving you a perspective of the war from the British and the men who led the British forces, and talks a lot about Saratoga and the plan that unraveled here. So check it out if you're interested. Once again, I'll link it on the post on Twitter and Facebook. And also, if you could leave a rating and review on iTunes, that'd mean a ton. Reach out to me, Chris at A Teacher's History, if you have questions, and find me on Twitter at A Teacher's Hist or on Facebook. See you next week.